Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name is Doug Bruggeman. I'm the founder of Ecological Services and Markets. I'm sponsoring the webinar. So at Ecological Services and Markets, we specialize in developing market-based approaches for sustainability with a focus on developing landscape-scale species crediting systems. So I first want to start by thanking our steering committee, including Greg DeYoung, Sarah Johnson, and Donna Collier. And so, as you know, much attention is given to crediting programs under the Endangered Species Act, and yet progress tends to remain slow and some would argue painful. And private capital is looking for ways to help mitigate the global extinction crisis. And we are expecting upcoming U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service mitigation policy coming in the spring. And we're very excited here to hear about the NOAA policy today. That was released this summer. So the objective of the webinar is to create an open community to discuss successes and barriers in species markets. And by shining a brighter light on species markets, our goal is to create new markets and strengthen existing markets. Further, we hope to provide more effective relationships with trustee agencies. So we really appreciate all of you attending. We're really grateful to have Lyla Pirkola here from NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service to highlight the mitigation policy for trustee resources under NOAA. So Lyla's going to give about a 30-minute presentation, and during that time, I would encourage you to pose your questions. If you come up with a question, just write it in the chat box, and you can just pose it to everybody. And then once Lyla's done, we'll go through those questions. And then once we're finished with those questions, we will then invite you to unmute yourself or raise your hand or try to get a discussion going. So we really want to hear from you about this major advancement and policy that we're discussing here today. So again, really appreciate you logging on. Excited to have Lyla to give a presentation. And so I'm going to turn it over to Lyla, and she's going to jump on in. How can we support you, Lyla?
Thank you. That all sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, there we go. Are you guys all seeing me in presenter mode?
It looks great.
Awesome. Thank you for the introduction, Doug. My name is Lyla Pirkola. I am with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service in the West Coast region. And yeah, basically, like Doug said, I'm going to be speaking today a little So we'll start with the purpose and goals of the policy. The policy is intended to be a set of principles that guide how our agency makes mitigation decisions in order to achieve positive conservation outcomes. And so these goals include prevention and offset of NOAA's trust resources, and with the end goal being to achieve the objectives and purposes of our authorities and our programs. We also are seeking to help action agencies and project proponents develop appropriate mitigation measures, helping the folks that we're working with come to us with good mitigation that meets the needs and expectations of what we're looking at. And then a process of just things being very transparent, and what you get when it comes to mitigation with NOAA. Why do we need a mitigation policy? So NOAA operates under multiple authorities. There's a whole suite. So some of our programs Act, we have NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries, and a coral program. So all of these are kind of programs and authorities that NOAA deals in that have a tie in some way or another to mitigation. So that's sort of the green box in the middle there. Under each of those authorities and programs, we have regional guidance, state by state MOUs, interagency guidance, how do we work with mitigation? An umbrella over all of these various authorities and guidance to create some consistency among the greater NOAA community of practice. And so it really should be looked at as kind of a big picture guide of how does NOAA as a greater agency under all these different authorities look at mitigation. So a couple of key definitions before we dig into the policy. I'm sure as many of you know, depending on which document you're looking at or which policy, everything's got a different definition. So when we're talking about mitigation in the context of this presentation and the NOAA policy, we're using a regulatory definition, meaning measures that are taken to avoid, minimize, and compensate for adverse impacts. And so some of NOAA's programs that are covered by this policy, they may not necessarily use the exact term mitigation, but they would be utilizing this concept, recommending avoidance, minimization, and compensation. So for example, under the Natural Resources Management Assessment Act, you may see the term compensatory restoration rather than compensatory mitigation. But for the purposes of this policy, that would be considered mitigation. So that's how we're looking at it. Another key definition that you're going to hear me use a lot as we walk through the policy statements is NOAA Trust Resources. So this is basically anything that NOAA has diadromous fish species. Endangered and threatened marine species listed under the ESA are also NOAA Trust Resources. Again, this includes diadromous fish species, also includes their designated critical habitat, and NOAA also has jurisdiction over marine mammals and marine turtles as part of our NOAA Trust Resources. We also are looking at marshes, mangroves, seagrass beds, coral reefs, anything coastal habitat. That's sort of what we're working with. It'll also include areas that are identified as essential fish habitat or EFH under NOAA Trust Resources. And then this is always kind of one that seems like it's coming from left field, but aquatic habitats and resources within the Great Lakes may also be considered a NOAA Trust resource. So as we go through this, kind of talk on the policy and I speak to NOAA Trust resources, that could include any number of any of these examples here. So let's dig into it. The policy makes 8 main statements, and the rest of what I'm going to talk about today is just kind of running through each of these 8 statements. mitigation strategies that have a high probability of success. Climate change and climate resilience should be considered when we're evaluating and developing mitigation. Our compensatory mitigation should be proportional to impacts and should offset those impacts to the full extent. Seventh policy statement speaks specifically to preservation and the use of preservation as compensation, that can happen appropriately and particularly taking into account high risk of habitat loss in many of the areas that we're working in. And then our final policy statement is a statement on collaboration with other partner agencies and stakeholders, and how we'd like that to look. So we'll start with policy statement 1, the mitigation sequence. This statement basically says to apply the mitigation sequence appropriately. Generally speaking, what that means is avoid, followed by minimize, followed by compensate. Generally speaking, we will always recommend or require avoidance of adverse impacts if it's a high value habitat. However, the policy also speaks on consideration being given to the weight of effectiveness in a measure, effectiveness of achieving environmental benefit, environmental uplift. So there are times where we view that it's appropriate to go out of sequence as far as mitigation. So I've got a couple examples for you. So example 1, this is a pretty standard, what you expect from a mitigation sequence. In this example, an applicant requests a permit to dredge and fill 3 acres of eelgrass habitat for a marina and waterfront restaurant. The standard sequence here, to avoid the restaurant, could be placed upland. That would avoid 1 acre of fill into the eelgrass. Minimization measure. There could be a redesign of the docks and potentially a new design that would require less dredging. So that's your minimization. And then compensation, offsite restoration of 2 acres of eelgrass within the same tidal system. That's kind of probably what most people are familiar with. A pretty straightforward mitigation sequence. Example 2 kind of shows where we may make the decision to take the sequence out of order in a scenario that will result in a greater habitat benefit by taking this sequence. And so in this example, an applicant is consulting under the ESA to dredge 3 acres of urban harbor bottom. And this is an area that is currently providing low quality habitat for listed fish species. And as part of their proposal, they propose to restore 10 acres of high quality habitat in the same system. And so in this case, avoidance and minimization, are likely still suggested within the consultation. But there's some flexibility to maybe not emphasize avoidance and minimization quite as much due to limitations in the ESA. Under ESA Section 7 and Section 10, we are not able to require avoidance. We can recommend avoidance, but avoidance, it can't be a requirement unless it's a project that's looking at a jeopardy or an adverse mod. So that kind of limits at times, what avoidance measures we can really implement. So, it's a proposal like this, we're seeing above and beyond offset. And so less emphasis could be placed on the avoidance and minimization, looking at the mitigation sequence in this way. Ultimately, the goal of any of our authorities is, improved conservation outcome. So if we're seeing that through this sequencing, that would be, something that would be appropriate for us to accept. Policy statement 2 speaks on best available scientific information. This is pretty standard for anything that our agency does. And, it's specifically included in some of our authorities, the Endangered Species Act specifically cites best available science, among others. So this is pretty cut and dry, but obviously worth being included when we're looking at recommending, developing, planning, and implementing our mitigation. Any of those decisions should be made based on the best available science, and that can include data, models, tech info, assessments, surveys and sampling, monitoring programs where it's appropriate. That could be local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, mathematical models. So this really, the best available science is what's guiding our mitigation decisions. Policy statement number 3 speaks to applying a holistic approach to mitigation. And specifically, it uses the words landscape and seascape. So what we're really trying to get at here is, taking a look at mitigation in a bigger picture context. The goal is to select an option that best achieves conservation objectives for the NOAA trust resources, for the species, for the habitat type, and really looking at that bigger picture scale. A case study for this, in Tampa Bay, there is a Tampa Bay estuary program, and this figure here on the right was pulled from their 2020 Habitat Master Plan. And what in areas. And so you can kind of get a bigger picture view of how existing conservation, in progress conservation, availability of conservation. Plans like this really speak to that landscape, seascape approach. We don't want just pockets of habitat here and there. We want to really, really be mindful and considerate of how mitigation and restoration is fitting in to the greater landscape, seascape ecosystem for those resources. Policy statement number 4 speaks to mitigation success. And I'll just read this one out. NOAA will support mitigation measures that provide a high degree of certainty in their effectiveness and durability, while also achieving the best conservation outcome for NOAA's trust resources. So we really, when we are implementing mitigation, we want to ensure success to the highest degree possible. And so there's some tools that we have that we utilize, to increase that certainty. So having really measurable performance standards, monitoring requirements, and management plans, adaptive management plans, long-term. These are all tools that we have to kind of minimize risk and increase certainty of any given mitigation project. Often when we talk about mitigation success, there's sort of this idea of it's supposed to last forever and ever into perpetuity. The NOAA policy actually does not require that. So NOAA's mitigation policy requires long-term protection. And so this can vary case by case, but just many of our banks and our resources are in coastal areas that are very subject to dynamic and changing environments. So I've got an example of that here. This is the Fina La Terra Bank. It was established in the 80s in Louisiana, and it was in a coastal area that ended up experiencing land loss. And so what had happened in this case was the bank was expected upon development to have a life of 7 years. after 25 years, the manager was not willing or couldn't commit to continue to manage because of the land loss and sea level rise. And so as a result of that, only 25/77ths of the original potential credits ended up being approved by the IRT to actually be released and sold. And so this resulted in mitigation bankers in Louisiana kind of looking for an exemption to in perpetuity. And I think it really makes sense for NOAA and just sort of the nature of our resources that perpetuity may not apply to every situation. And so this example is really just kind of to show that these are things that we need to be thinking about in the front end of bank establishment. You know, we can accept, yes, there's going to be land loss that's going to happen. This bank may not last forever and ever into perpetuity, but we do really need to be clear up front about what the expectations are for how long it's going to last so that we can make appropriate analyses as far as it operating as an offset to impacts. And so kind of speaking to land loss, that transitions us nicely into kind of the concept here of climate change. And so policy statement 5 lays out for us that we really want to be considering climate change and climate resilience when we're evaluating and developing mitigation measures. So you can kind of see in this map here along the Louisiana coast where the bank I was previously speaking on is located. You know, that's that dark red, very high vulnerability to sea level rise. Whereas maybe some of these areas around the panhandle of Florida or up in kind of the Florida, Georgia Bight area where you're seeing the yellow and orange, those are areas that are less vulnerable to sea level rise. And so maybe would be a better consideration for mitigation. And when we're thinking about kind of climate change within the context of mitigation, you know, we really need to consider how the effects of climate change are going to influence the effectiveness of the mitigation. And this could be sea level rise, changes to the habitat, the physical habitat itself. But this also could include changes that may occur in species range as habitats are changing and temperatures are warming and things like that. What's that going to do to the range of species, and will the mitigation still be applicable as those changes occur? So we just definitely need to be realistic as far as looking into long-term viability of mitigation within the context of a changing climate. Policy statement 6 speaks to the amount of compensation. This statement reads, implement compensatory mitigation that is proportional to impacts to NOAA trust resources and offsets those impacts to the full extent provided by NOAA authorities. And so when we're thinking about the amount of compensation, we want the mitigation to be proportional in scale to the impacts to resources. And we also are looking to have it be of a sufficient quantity and quality to offset those impacts. And we need to be really looking at any interim losses or temporal losses. So, you know, an example of this, say, someone is going in and dumping a bunch of rock slope protection into an area that's a main migratory pathway for a species of salmon. And they're proposing to mitigate for those habitat impacts, but the mitigation on the ground land won't be restored for, say, 5 years. The expectation would be that mitigation should include the temporal losses and the impacts to those species over the 5 years between when the impacts occurred and when the mitigation occurred. And this is particularly important for species that have kind of shorter lifespans where 5 years, that's impacting 5 separate generations. It's just really, really important that we're looking at the temporal losses when we're looking at the amount of compensation that would be required for any given project. And then along with that, we need to take uncertainty into account. So if there's an increased level of uncertainty, generally that's going to create need for an increased amount of mitigation. You know, assuming risk, basically kind of more risk, more reward, or potential for the opposite. And so oftentimes what we'll do is require an increased mitigation ratio in order to kind of mitigate for that uncertainty. Topic 7, preservation. So I get questions about this one a lot. How does NOAA look at preservation? Do you accept preservation? So I'm very happy that the policy specifically addressed this in a statement, and I have a good answer that I can give folks. So policy statement says, use preservation of intact habitat as compensation appropriately, taking into account the high risk of habitat loss in many coastal and marine landscapes and seascapes. So the policy does support habitat preservation as a form of mitigation, but it is limited to certain situations. And so that specifically would be when the habitat proposed to be preserved is a habitat that is at a high risk of loss or degradation. Or preservation can have some relevance when the long-term conservation benefits of preserving the habitat would outweigh the impacts that are requiring the mitigation. So here's sort of an example of that. On the left, you have a scenario where this little pink square in the bottom right, that's an existing development. In this scenario, they've developed this dark red area and offset it, restored farmed wetlands on the left side of that box there. They've fully mitigated for their impacts through the restoration of that farmed wetland. Unfortunately, along with that, you've got some degradation of the wetland forest. In the example on the right, in this example, there's a smaller proposed development area. And so in this example, they've preserved this entire dark green box above the development. So this is something that would likely be at high risk of loss from that development, kind of shown in the box on the left there. And so in doing that, they ended up purchasing more credits, quote unquote, more land, because it was a preservation context instead of a restoration context. But we can see that potentially may leave this farmed wetland on the left side of the box available for restoration. And that land area is likely something that wouldn't be at high risk for development or for loss. And so we can see kind of an improved conservation outcome using the preservation approach in this scenario. And then also to note on here, generally when we're looking at accepting preservation as compensatory mitigation, we'd be requiring a higher ratio in order to offset. So the example on the left with restoration, that's a 2-to-1 ratio. So for every 1 acre that was impacted by the development, 2 acres were restored. In the preservation example, for every 1 acre that was impacted by the development, 10 acres were preserved. So generally, this is how you'll see preservation treated compared to restoration, in the context of our consultations and such. And these ratios can be really, really variable. They're based on multiple factors, the habitat quality, where the impacts are occurring, the habitat quality of the area that's proposed to be preserved, And my understanding is within the region, for preservation, we've seen anything from a 4-to-1 ratio to a 33-to-1 ratio when we're accepting preservation as an offset. Another example here of how preservation can really be a tool for us. It's a great way for us to aim to maintain ecosystem integrity and can kind of contribute to our landscape, seascape, scale planning. So one of the most common forms of preservation that we see is the purchase and conservation of wetlands or aquatic habitat that are under the threat of loss. And often these are areas that would provide connection to existing conservation lands. So this figure here is from the North Florida Land Trust. The green boxes are conservation land. The blue and yellow are easements and preservations. And so you can kind of see how those act as a means to maintain these connections. And again, focusing on that landscape, seascape approach where we're not seeing just little pockets of really, really awesome habitat here and there, but not kind of the greater connection, bigger picture. The final statement of the policy speaks to collaboration. So really aiming to work in collaboration and coordination with all of our agency partners, stakeholder groups, our bank sponsor communities, project proponents, tribes. Really, really want to put an emphasis on that collaboration. I think anyone who has worked even the tiniest little bit when it comes to mitigation and conservation banking knows how huge that is. This statement speaks specifically to using a timely and transparent process. We really want to be able to provide consistency. We want things to be predictable. And finally, the statement is, seeks to engage on these projects early on during planning, during design, when there's an opportunity to provide feedback and kind of sculpt that mitigation to get resolution for all parties. So kind of common sense collaboration occurs through the interagency review teams. But then we also want to engage with mitigation through other existing means of cooperation. And so working with our partner agencies and tribal partners on developing common mitigation recommendations, developing consistent compliance approaches, common criterias and standards, and then thinking about the greater, larger community scale of things. We really want to be engaged with communities and stakeholders to develop landscape and seascape plans, kind of some of those examples that I spoke to earlier, looking at the bigger picture and, how can we coordinate this with everyone who's got a stake in this. And then we'd like to be available to disseminate data, to provide tools and trainings and, kind of all just whatever collaboration is possible to reach those goals of, implementing consistent mitigation, good mitigation, and benefit to our species and our trust resources. And so with that, big thank you to Susan Marie Stedman, Catherine Shepard, West Coast Region Mitigation Team, Headquarters Mitigation Team through NOAA, everyone who worked on this policy and these trainings and, helped provide me with these slides and things like that. Huge thank you. And thank you all for your attention and attendance today. And I'd be happy to take questions.
Great. Well, Lyla, thank you so much for that very comprehensive review of the policy that was just released this summer. And I've got one question here in the chat from Chris Medek. So relative to the idea that the bank might not function in perpetuity, is the thought that credits will be adjusted to only account for the areas that will function in perpetuity, or is the thought that only projects with temporary impacts would be able to use credits in a bank that is not anticipated to be preserved in perpetuity?
I think that it could play out either way. I think that kind of the bottleneck or the pinch point in considering either of those scenarios would kind of land more with the bank sponsor rather than NOAA Fisheries. Like if there's a bank that we could potentially provide offset, but only to temporary acts, I don't see any opposition to us signing off on that based on that logic. I just don't know that that would make sense from a market standpoint for a bank sponsor to do it that way. But I think either one could be realistic. Every bank, every site is different, and so it would just be something that would kind of have to play out in the IRT process and looking at, what functional uplift for what amount of time are we expecting from here, and then crediting it based on that information.
Okay, great. Great. So that was our one question in the chat. I want to invite you guys to raise your hand or unmute yourself. I guess I'll go ahead and ask a question. In terms of climate change, so the policy is very clear on the importance of incorporating climate change into mitigation and definition of equivalence. Are you seeing any new approaches or financial assurances to account for climate change?
Ooh. I mean, as far as financial assurances and approaches kind of within that realm, no. I think most of where I'm seeing climate change kind of being incorporated is more so like site selection and design and kind of that side of things. I definitely think that that's kind of interesting to think about what means of financial assurances maybe could be in place in order to limit certainty as it relates to climate change. But just in my experience, I'm not familiar with anything off the top of my head.
Okay. Yeah, well, it's certainly an important topic that we're going to be learning a lot about in the future as we implement these projects.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anyone else have a question for Lyla?
Hi, I have a question. It's kind of related to the climate change issues you were just touching on.
Great.
I was wondering how you touched a little bit on the perpetuity issues and the range of ratios that may apply related thereto. How does that relate to a site where, you might have sea level rise or a similar change in circumstances, and therefore, perhaps the acreage of your mitigation proposal is somewhat, I'll use the word uncertain for lack of a better way to describe that.
Yeah, so in a scenario like that, I guess there's two different ways to think about it. There's sort of mitigation on a project by project, or sort of, are you talking about in this scenario, like in the creation of a bank? If it's the creation of a bank, I think that that's something that would hash out in the crediting process. Kind of as we're doing our analysis of this bank and how many credits we would be giving, we would kind of take that temporal aspect into account while determining those credits. If it was sort of a permittee responsible and we're trying to look at the impacts of climate change, I've actually got an example. So I'm working on some levee repair projects where the design includes a launchable rock tow. So the concept is that it's all this rock that's dumped into the river, and then they cover it and make actually look like habitat. And so it's soil filled and planted, and it's essentially a planting bench. But the way that it's designed is that if flows come through and start to erode that bank, then the rocks underneath this planted area will launch, and that planted area may be lost. And so in this example, what we've done is basically, we looked at modeling of how much anticipated loss there may be based on our anticipated flows. This isn't a riverine system, but you could kind of do the same modeling for a coastal area. But we estimated kind of a rough estimate of, okay, realistically in the next 100 years, we could expect up to 1 acre of this to launch based on our expected erosion levels. And so then we asked for additional mitigation at a lower ratio for that area that was at risk of loss. And so I think, that's an approach that we would when it comes to, coastal climate change related potential for loss as well.
Excellent. Thanks. Super helpful.
Great. All right. So we have a hand up, and so it's a good thing. If you guys want to raise your hand, a good way to get the discussion by Greg DeYoung. Greg, do you have a question?
Yeah, Lyla, really encouraging to see this policy come out and great presentation. There's a lot of really great stuff in it. A couple things that caught my eye were mitigation standards, which we found to be so helpful if we can be directed as practitioners, if we can actually have mitigation standards. And then along those same lines, landscape or seascape plans. What a wondrous thing if we could be guided by those. And I would imagine that staff resources are probably an issue, but are there, do you have sort of a vision for how some of those kinds of things could take place in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see some of that kind of on a case by case area based on what makes sense for geographies through HCPs and, and other tools like that. I think there's a lot of potential when we're looking at forecasting for real large scale infrastructure projects. I think there's a huge opportunity there, particularly looking at early engagement and, when we've got big projects that are affecting a majority of the watershed and huge impacts. I think that's where we really could benefit from kind of leveraging where we may not have the staffing to fully dedicate to jumping on some of those efforts, but leveraging those partnerships and utilizing it that way.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very practical answer, and which means it's probably how it's going to get done. But I wondered, it made me think the questions about sea level rise and climate change. It made me think about recovery plans, and this is probably too big a question for this forum, but made me think about the need perhaps to go back and revisit recovery plans, in light of climate change. But again, that's probably too big of something to tackle here.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something to think about, the more that we're working with these species and these landscapes and improving our understanding of the species and habitats, as well as what we can expect from climate change effects. We see some of that expressed through like 5-year status reviews for species. But yeah, really the recovery plan being sort of our Bible, our guiding document for everything related to that species. Definitely important to continue to consider how climate change may change some of what's included in those.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great. Other comments or questions? Well, I'll just make a comment and hopefully somebody else will pipe in. One thing I really liked about the policy was the definition of landscape scale. Like, so you defined it landscape scale not based on spatial scale, but based on ecological function. Like, what are the components of the ecosystem that are interacting to constitute a landscape function? And so I think that's a critical step forward in terms of mitigation, because I think we tend to just want to look at a map and say, this is the area and this is what a landscape scale is, rather than thinking about what those ecological functions are across the landscape. So that was great.
Yeah, absolutely. And, especially as we look forward to, potentially some new unique forms of mitigation. There may not always be the opportunity to acquire a parcel of land and do what we traditionally think of as mitigation. And so I think sort of in that definition, the policy leaves open the opportunity for mitigation based on that concept of function. So maybe it's fish passage, burial, removal, an assortment of different things that ultimately improve the function of that habitat and the functioning of the species without necessarily, like it to, it has to look exactly like this because that's what it's always looked like.
Right, exactly. Great. Well, I'm not seeing more questions or hands up. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to present to us this very important step forward in policy. And I guess I just give you a chance to make any comments on the way out as we close.
So I just dropped the link to our policy announcement in the chat. So if folks haven't seen that yet or interested in digging into the policy itself, you can go ahead and follow that link. And then someone had asked if these